Hey crew, it's Pitt, and I'm back with some more knowledge. Today we are diving back into the works of G.R.S. Mead. This is Fragments of a Faith Forgotten. We are reading aloud and discussing as we go along the various points that are brought to light by the text. It is not the format for everyone, but people do find value in it, so you are more than welcome to tag along as we continue our exploration. Before we begin, however, if you are unfamiliar with me, any of my unconventional beliefs, or if at any point in time I lose you in terminology, there will be several playlists linked in the corner above, in the box down below, along with the original source material and the link for my book, so that you can get a better understanding of who I am and why I say the things that I do. With that being said, we are going to dive in and continue our exploration of Fragments of a Faith Forgotten with Alexandria. The rough outlines of the background of the Gnosis, which we have endeavored to sketch, are of necessity of the vaguest, for each of the many subjects touched upon is deserving of a volume or several volumes. Our intention has only been to give some general idea to the manifold lines along which its complicated heredity has to be traced. But our sketch is so vague that perhaps it may be as well, before proceeding further, to give the reader some notion of the more immediate outer conditions in which the Christian Gnosis lived and, we will not say died, but disappeared. Insistence upon some of the points already touched upon and a few more details may serve to make the matter clearer, and the best spot from which to make our observation is Alexandria. And the best time for a retrospect is the epoch when general Christianity had definitely won its victory and driven out the Gnosis from the field. It should be remembered that in the following sketch we shall attempt to depict only the outward appearances of things. Within, as we have already suggested, and as we shall show in the sequel, there was a hidden life of great activity. If there was an enormous public library at Alexandria, there were also many private libraries of the inner schools dealing with the sacred science of unseen things. It was precisely from these private circles that all mystic writings proceeded, and we can see from the nature of the Gnostic and other works of this kind which have reached us, that their authors and compilers had access to large libraries of mystic lore. Let us then carry our minds forward to the last quarter of the 4th century in the present era, when Hypatia was a girl, after the hopes of the school that had traced its descent through Plato and Pythagoras from Orpheus had received so rude a shock from the early death of Julian, the emperor philosopher, just in time to see the Serapeum still standing, unviolated by the iconoclastic hands of a fanaticism that was the immediate progeny of Jewish zealotism, and entirely foreign to the teachings of the Christ. Let us ascend to the great lighthouse, 400 feet high, on the island off the mainland, the world-famous Pharos, and take a bird's-eye view of the intellectual center of the ancient Western world. The city lies out before us on a long ribbon of land, or isthmus, between seafront and the great lake towards the south, Lake Mareotis. Far away to the left is the most westerly mouth of the Nile, called the Canopic, and the great canal winds out that way to Canopus, where it is the sacred shrine of Serapis. Along it, if it were festival time, you would see crowds of pilgrims hastening on gaily decorated barges to pay their homage to certain wise priests, one of whom about this time was a distinguished member of the later Platonic school. The great city, with its teeming populace, stretches out before us with a sea frontage of some 4 or 5 miles. In shape, it is oblong, for when Alexander the Great, hundreds of years ago in 331 BC, marked out its original walls with the flower of his Macedonian veterans carried, perhaps according to some national rite, he traced it in the form of a chlamys, a scarf twice as long as it was broad. 2 great streets, or main arteries, in the form of a cross, divided into 4 quarters. These thoroughfares are far wider than any of our modern streets, and the longer one, parallel to the shore and extending through the outlying suburbs, has a length of 3 leagues, so that the Alexandrians consider it quite a journey to traverse their city. Where these streets cross is a great square, surrounded with handsome buildings and adorned with fountains, statues, and trees. There are many other squares and forums also, but none so vast as the Great Square. Many pillars and obelisks adorn the city, the most conspicuous of them being a flat-topped pillar of red stone on a hill near the shore, and two obelisks on the shore itself, one of which is the present Cleopatra's Needle. The island on which we are standing is joined to the mainland by a huge mole almost a mile long, with two waterways cutting it, spanned with bridges and defended with towers. This mole helps to form the great harbor on our right, and the smaller and less safe harbor on our left. There is also a third huge dock or basin in the northwest quarter of the city, closed also by a bridge. The two main thoroughfares divide Alexandria into four quarters, which, together with the first suburb of the city, were originally called by the first five letters of the alphabet. The great quarter on our left is, however, more generally known as the Bronchium, perhaps from the palace Ptolemy Soter set aside to form the nucleus of the great library. It is the Greek quarter, the most fashionable and architecturally very magnificent. There you see the vast mausoleum of Alexander the Great, containing the golden coffee in which the body of the world-conquering hero has been preserved for hundreds of years. There, too, are the splendid tombs of the Ptolemies, who ruled Egypt from the time of the division of Alexander's empire till the latter part of the 1st century BC, when the Romans wrested the kingdom from Cleopatra. Observe next the great temple of Poseidon, god of the sea, a favorite deity of the sailor populace. There, too, is the museum, the center of the university, with all its lecture rooms and halls. Not the original museum of the Ptolemies, but a later building. Baths, too, you see everywhere, thousands of them. Magnificent buildings where the luxurious Alexandrians spend so much of their time. On the right is the Egyptian quarter, the northwestern, called Rakatis, a very old name dating back to a time when Alexandria did not exist, and an old Egyptian burg called Ragadua occupied its site. The difference in the style of architecture at once strikes you, for it is the most part of the more somber Egyptian style. And that great building you see in the eastern part of the quarter is the far-famed Serapeum. It is not so much a single building as a group of buildings, the temple, of course, being the chief of them. It is a fort-like place with plain, heavy walls, older than the Greek buildings, gloomy and severe and suited to the Egyptian character. It is the center of the heathen schools, that is to say, the barbarian or non-Greek lecture halls. You will always remember the Serapeum by its vast flights of steps bordered with innumerable sphinxes, both inside and outside the great gate. If you could see underneath the buildings, you would be struck with the network of vaults and crypts on which the whole city seems to have been built. These vaults are used mostly as underground cisterns for the storage of water, a most necessary provision in so poorly rain-fed a country as Egypt. The southeastern quarter, behind the Bronchium, is the center of the Jewish colony, which dates back to the days of Alexander himself and has never numbered less than 40,000 Hebrews. The great open space to the left of the Bronchium is the Hippodrome, or racecourse, and further east, still, along the shore is the fashionable suburb of Nicopolis, where perchance Hypatia lives. On the other side of the city, beyond Rakatis, is a huge cemetery adorned with innumerable statues and columns and known as Necropolis. But the various styles of architecture and distinct characteristics of the various quarters can give but little idea of the mixed and heterogeneous populace assembled on the spot where Europe, Asia, and Africa meet together. First, you have to find the better class Egyptians and Greeks, most extremely refined, haughty, and effeminate. Of Romans, but a few. The magistrates and military, the legionnaires of the guard who patrolled the city and quelled the frequent riots of religious disputants, for all of whom, Jew or not Christian, Gnostic or heathen, They had a bluff and impartial contempt. In the more menial offices, you see the lower class mixed Egyptians, the descendants of the aboriginal populace perchance, crowds of them. Thousands of Ethiopians and Negroes also, in the brightest possible colors. There, too, you see bands of monks from the Thebaid, many from the Nitrian Valley, 2 or 3 journeys south into the desert, beyond the Great Lake. They are easily distinguishable with their tangled, unkempt locks and skins for sole clothing. For the most part at this time a violent, ignorant, and ungovernable set of fanatics. Mixed with them are people in black, ecclesiastics, deacons, and officers of the Christian churches. Down by the harbors, however, we shall come across many other types, difficult to distinguish for the most part because of the interblending and mixture. Thousands of them come and go on the small ships which crowd the harbors and fleets. Many are akin to the once great nation of the so-called Hittites, Phoenician and Carthaginian folk, sailor folk in numbers, and traders from far more distant ports. Jews everywhere, and those akin to Jews in all the trading parts, some resembling Afghans. Ascetics, too, from Syria, descended from the Essenes perchance, or Theraputae, paying great attention to cleanliness. Also a few tall, golden-haired people, Goths and Teutons perchance, extremely contemptuous of the rest, whom they regard as an effeminate crowd. Big, tall, strong, rough fellows. A few Persians also, and more distant Orientals. Perhaps, however, you are more interested in the Christian populace, a most mixed crowd without and within. The city ecclesiastics are busied more with politics than with religion. The rest of the faithful can be divided into 2 classes, offering widely different presentiments of Christianity. On the one hand, the lowest classes and many of the monks, bigoted and ignorant, contemptuous of all education, devoted to the cult of the martyrs, thirsting for the blood of the Jews, and wild to overthrow every statue and raze every temple to the ground. On the other hand, a set of refined disputants, philosophical theologians, arguing always, eager to enter the list with the pagan philosophers, spending their lives in public discussions. While the crowds who came to hear them are mostly indifferent to the right or wrong of the matter and applaud every debating point with contemptuous impartiality, enjoying the wrangle from the point of view of a refined skepticism. But we must hasten on with our task and complete our sketch of the city with a brief reference to 2 of its most famous institutions, the library and the museum. Even if most of us have had no previous acquaintance with the topography of Alexandria and are perfectly ignorant of the history of its schools, we have, at any rate, all heard of its world-famed library. When the kingdom of Alexander was divided among his generals, the rich kingdom of Egypt fell to the lot of Ptolemy I, called Soter, the Savior, believing that Greek culture was the most civilizing factor in the known world, and Greek methods the most enlightened. Soter determined not only to make a small Greece in Egypt, but also to make his court at Alexandria the asylum for all the learning of the Grecian world. Fired with this noble ambition, he founded a museum, or university, dedicated to the arts and sciences, and a library. Had not Aristotle the philosopher taught his great leader Alexander the art of government, and should not the chief of his generals, therefore, gather together all the works that dealt with so useful a science? Fortunately, however, the original plan of a purely political library was speedily abandoned, and more universal views prevailed. It is, however, not unlikely that Ptolemy, as an Egyptian ruler, did but found a new library for his capital in emulation of the many libraries already existing in that ancient land. We have only to recall the vast collection of Ozymandias at Thebes, the remedy of the soul, to be persuaded of the fact. Therefore, though the Alexandrian library was the first great public Grecian library, it was by no means the first in Egypt, nor was it even the first library in Greece, for Polycrates of Samos, Pisistratus and Euclides of Athens, Nicocrates of Cyprus, Euripides the poet, and Aristotle himself had all large collections of books. To be brief, the first collection was placed in the part of the royal palaces near the Canopic Gate, the chief of these palaces being called the Bruncheon, close to the museum. A librarian and a staff were appointed, an army of copyists and calligraphists. There were also scholars to revise and correct the text and Corazontes to select the authentic and best editions, also makers of catalogs, categories, and analytics. Under the first Ptolemies, the collecting of books became quite a mania. Ptolemy Soter had letters sent to all the reigning sovereigns begging for copies of every work in their country possessed, whether of poets, logographers, or writers of sacred aphorisms, orators, sophists, doctors, medical philosophers, historians, etc. Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, commissioned every captain of a vessel to bring him manuscripts, for which he paid so royally that many forgeries were speedily put on the market. Attalus and Eumenes, kings of Pergamus in northwest Asia Minor, that would be Turkey today, established a rival library in their capital and prosecuted the search for books with such ardor that the library of Aristotle, bequeathed to Theophrastus and handed on to Nellius of Skepsis, had to be buried to escape the hands of their rapacious collectors, only to find its way, however, to Alexandria at last. Philadelphus accordingly issued an order against the exportation of papyrus from Egypt, and thus the rival collectors of Pergamus had to be content with vellum. Hence, some say, pergamene, parchemine, parchment. The commerce of manuscripts was carried on throughout all Greece, Rhodes and Athens being the chief marts. Thus, Alexandria became possessed of the most ancient manuscripts of Homer and Hesiod and the Cyclic poets, of Plato and Aristotle, of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, and many other treasures. Moreover, large numbers of translators were employed to turn the books of other nations into Greek. The sacred books of the nations were translated, and the Septuagint version of the Hebrew Bible was added to the number, not without miracle, if we are to believe the legend recounted by Josephus. Even by the time of Ptolemy III, Euergetes, the Bruchion could not contain all the books, and a fresh nucleus was established in the buildings of the Serapeum, on the other side of the city, but not in the temple itself with its 400 pillars, of all of which Pompey's pillar alone remains to us. What a wealth of books in so short a time! Even in the time of the first three Ptolemies, we read of over 400,000 rolls or volumes. What then must have been the number in later years? Some say they exceeded 1,000,000 rolls in papyri. Let us, however, remember that a book, or roll, was generally not a volume as with us, but rather the chapter of a work. We read of men writing 6,000 books. The rolls had to be comparatively small for the sake of convenience, and a work often had as many rolls as it contained books. We must, therefore, bearing this in mind, be on our guard against exaggerating the size of the great library. The Serapeum, however, soon contained as many books as the Bruchion, and all went well till 47 B.C., when the great fire which destroyed Caesar's fleet burnt the Bruchion to the ground. An imaginative versifier, Lucian, asserts that the glow of the conflagration could be seen as far as Rome. So they had to rebuild the Bruchion and put into the new building the famous library of Pergamus, which the city had bequeathed to the Senate, and which the infatuated Mark Antony handed over to Cleopatra, last of the Ptolemies. When the glory of Alexandria began to depart, its library began to share its fate. Julian, the emperor, 360 to 363, took many volumes to enrich his own library. When the Christian fanatics in 387 stormed the Serapeum, they razed the temple to its foundation, and nothing of the library was left but the empty shelves. Finally, in 641, Amru, general of Omar, second in succession to the prophet, fed the furnaces of the 4,000 baths of Alexandria for full 6 months with Brunchion's priceless treasures. If what the rolls contained were in the Quran, they were useless. If what they were taught were not in the Quran, they were pernicious. In either case, burn them. Some Mohammedan apologists have lately tried to whitewash Omar and deny the whole story, but perhaps he has as little to be excused as the Christian barbarians who devastated the shelves of the Serapeum. It is my belief, with no foundation whatsoever, that most of those books that the Christians destroyed is probably underneath the Vatican. Such was the written material on which the scholars, scientists, and philosophers of Alexandria had to work. And not only was there a library, but also a kind of university called the Museum, dedicated to the arts and sciences, and embracing, among other things, an observatory, an amphitheater of anatomy, a vast botanical garden, an immense menagerie, and many other collections of things useful for physical research. It was an institution conceived on a most liberal plan, an assembly of savants lodged in a palace, richly endowed with the liberality of princes, exempt from public charges, without distinction of race or creed, with no imposed regulations, no set plan of study or lecture list. The members of this distinguished assembly were left free to persecute their researches and studies, untrammeled and unhampered. In their ranks were innumerable poets, historians, geometricians, mathematicians, astronomers, translators, critics, commentators, physicians, professors of natural science, philologists, grammarians, archaeologists. In brief, savants of all sorts, laying the first foundations of those researches which have, once more in our own time, after the lapse of centuries, claimed the attention of the world. True, the Museum of Alexandria made but faltering steps where today we stride on with such assurance, but the spirit and method were the same, feeble compared to our strength, but the same spirit now made strong by Palaeogenesis. Very like was the temper then in the last 3 centuries before the Christian era to the temper that has marked the last 3 centuries of our own time. Religion has lost its hold on the educated. Skepticism and science and misunderstood Aristotelian philosophy were alone worthy of a man of genius. There were emancipated women, too, and dialectical daughters, common enough in those latter days of Greece. Had not, thought these schoolmen, their great founder, Alexander, conquered the political world by following the vice of his master, Aristotle, they also would follow the teachings of the famous Stagirite, who had mapped out heaven and earth and all things therein, and soon they too would conquer what else of the world there was to be conquered, both natural and intellectual. It seemed so probable then, so simple and logical. It seems to be probable even now, to some minds. So they set to work with their commenting and criticizing, their philologizing and their grammar and accentuation, their categorizing and cataloging. They set to work to measure things. Being pupils of Euclid, they attempted to measure the distance of the sun from the earth, and Eratosthenes, by copper armillae, or circles, for determining the equinox, calculated the obliquity of the ecliptic, and by further researches calculated the circumference of the earth. He also mapped out the world from all the books of travel and earth knowledge in the great library. In mechanics, Archimedes solved the mysteries of the lever and hydrostatic pressure, which are the basis of our modern statics and hydrostatics. Hipparchus, too, thought out a series of the heavens, upside down in fact, but correct enough to calculate eclipses and the rest. And this, 300 years later, under the Antonines, was revamped by a certain Ptolemy, a commentator merely and not an inventor, a patent now standing in his name. Hipparchus was also the father of the plane and spherical trigonometry. But enough has already been said to give us an idea of the temper of the times, and it would be too long to dwell in the long list of famous names in other departments, encyclopedists and grammarians like Callimachus and Aristophanes, poets such as Theocritus. Thus, with the destruction of the building and the fire of Caesar's fleet, and with the Roman conquest, the first museum came to an end. It is true that a new museum was established in the reign of Claudius, 41 to 50 A.D., but it was a mere shadow of its former self, no true home of the Muses. But the official auditorium of the wearisome writings of the emperor scribbler, Claudius had written in Greek, Magis inepte quam in eleganter, as Suetonius remarks, 8 books of a history of Carthage, and 20 books of a history of Etruria. He would, therefore, establish a museum and have his precious writings read to sycophant professordom once a year at least. Thus passed away the glory of that incarnation of scholarship and science. It was a soulless thing at best, marking a period of unbelief and skepticism, and destined to pass away when once man woke again to the fact that he was a soul. And what of the outer schools of so-called philosophy during that period? They too were barren enough. The old sages of Greece were no more. Pythagoras, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle had passed from the sight of mortals. The men who followed them were, for the most part, word-splitters and phrase-weavers, dialectic arguers of the Megarian school, eristics and wranglers, Pharonistes and doubters, Cyrenaics who believed in the senses alone as the only avenues for knowledge, pessimists and annihilationists, a host of later skeptics, cynics, Epicureans, academics, Peripatetics, and Stoics. Epicureans who sought to live comfortably, Stoics, in opposition to Plato's doctrine of social virtues, asserted the solitary dignity of human individualism. After the 3 great reigns of the first Ptolemies, Alexandria fell morally, together with its rulers, for 180 years. Sophists wrangled, pedants fought over accents and readings with the true odium grammaticum, till Cleopatra, like Helen, betrayed her country to the Romans, and Egypt became a tributary province. So far there had been no philosophy in the proper sense of the word. That did not enter into the curriculum of the museum. Hitherto Alexandria had had no philosophy of her own, but now she is destined to be the crucible in which philosophic thought of every kind will be fused together. And not only philosophy, but, more important still, religio-philosophy and theosophy of every kind will be poured into the melting pot, and many strange systems and some things, admirably good and true, will be molded out of the matter cast into this seething crucible. So far, the Grecian genius has only thought of airing its own methods and views before the East. Into Egypt, Syria, Persia, into India even, it has flitted and sunned itself. It has taken many a year to convince Greek complacency that the period of world genius is not bounded on one hand by Homer and on the other by Aristotle. Slowly, but remorselessly, it is borne in upon Hellenic ingenuity that there is an antiquity in the world besides which it is a mere parvenu. The Greek may despise the Orientals and call them mere barbar or barbarians because they are strangers to the Attic tongue, but the barbarian is to laugh last and laugh best at all, for he has carefully guarded heirloom of wisdom, which he has not yet quite forgotten. The Greeks have had the tradition too, and have even revived it, but have now forgotten again. The skeptics have replaced Orpheus by Homer, and Pythagoras and the real Plato by Aristotle. Their mysteries are now Masonic and no longer real, except for the very, very few. And if the Greek despised the barbarian, the barbarian, in his turn, thought but little of the Greek. "You Greeks are but children, O Solon," said the wisest priest of Sais to the Attic lawgiver. "You Greeks misunderstand and change the sacred myths you have adopted, fickle and careless and superficial in things religious." Such was the criticism of the ancient barbarian on the young and innovating Greek. See Timaeus, part of the Ancient Lore playlist. Slowly but surely, the wisdom of the Egyptians, of the Babylonians and Chaldeans, and its reflection in some of the Jewish doctors of Persia too, and perhaps even of India, begins to react on the center of Grecian thought, and religion and all the great problems of the human soil begin to oust mere scholasticism, beaux arts and belles lettres from the schools. Alexandria is no longer to be a mere literary city, but a city of philosophy in the old sense of the term. It is to be wisdom-loving. Not that it will eventually succeed, even in this, but it will try to succeed. There is to be a new method, too. The concealed and hidden for so many centuries will be discussed and analyzed. There will be eclecticism, or a choosing out and synthesizing. There will be syncretism and a mingling of the most heterogeneous elements into some sort of patchwork. There will be analogeticism, or comparison and correspondencing. Efforts to discover a world religion, to reconcile the irreconcilable, to synthesize as well science, philosophy, and religion, to create a theosophy. It will apparently fail, for the race is nearing its end. It is the searching for truth at the end of a long life with an old brain, with too many tendencies and prejudices to eradicate. The race will die, and the souls that ensouled it will go out of incarnation, to reappear in due time when the wheel is turned. The old race is to be replaced with new blood, with new physical vigor, but the mind of the new race is incapable of grasping the problems of its predecessors. Goths, Teutons, Vandals, Huns, Celts, Britons, and Arabs are bodies for a far less developed batch of souls. True, the new race will also grow and develop and in its turn reach to manhood and old age and far transcend its predecessor in every way. But when a child, it will think as a child, when a man, as a man, and when aged, as the aged. What could the barbarian Huns and Goths and Arabs make of the great problems that confronted the highly civilized Alexandrians? For the new race, a new religion, therefore, suited to its needs, suited, perchance, to its genius, suited to its age. What its actual historic origins were are so far shrouded in impenetrable obscurity that what the real history of its founder was is impossible to discover. This much, however, is certain, that a new keynote was struck for the tuning up of a new instrument. It is always a dangerous thing to generalize too freely and paint the past in too staring splashes of color, for in human affairs we find nothing unmixed. Good was mixed with evil in the old method, and evil with good in the new. The new method was to force out into the open for all men a portion of the sacred mysteries and secret teachings of the few. The adherents of the new religion itself professed to throw open everything, and many believed that it had revealed all that was revealable. That was because they were, as yet, children. So bright was the light to them that they perforce believed it came directly from the God of all gods, or rather from God alone, for they would have no more of gods. The gods were straightway transmuted into devils. The many had begun to play with the psychic and spiritual forces let loose from the mysteries, and the many went mad for a time and have not yet regained their sanity. Let us dwell on this intensely interesting phenomenon for a few moments. It is true that in the Roman Empire, which had now reduced the world to its sway, and thus politically united so many streams of ancient civilization and barbarism into one ocean, things were in a very perilous state, morally and socially. The ancient order was beginning to draw to an end. Political freedom and independence were of the past, but intellectual and religious tolerance were still guaranteed. For so far, the ancient world knew not the meaning of intolerance. States were politically subordinated to the control of the Caesars, but the religious institutions of such states, on which their social life and national existence depended, were left in absolute freedom. Nevertheless, the spirit of reality had long left the ancient institutions. They were still maintained as part and parcel of statecraft and as necessary for the people, who must have a cult and festivals and religious shows, then as now. But few took the matter really seriously. For the educated there was philosophy and the shadow of the ancient mysteries. But these things were not for the people, not for the uneducated. The priestly orders had forgotten their duties and, using their knowledge for self-aggrandizement, had now almost entirely forgotten what they had once known. It is an old, old story. The ancient church was corrupt, the ancient state enslaved. There must be a protest, partly right, partly wrong, as usual, good and evil protesting against evil and good. It is true that the mysteries were free and open to all who are worthy. It is true that morals and virtues are essentially essential prerequisites, but not these alone. It is true that there is but one God, but Yahweh is not that deity. It is true that there are grades of being and intelligence between the supreme and man, but the gods are not the work of men's hands or devils, while the angels are creatures of light. It is true that philosophy alone cannot solve the problem, but it must not be neglected. It is true that all men will be saved, but not rather the poor than the rich, the ignorant than the learned. In Protestantism, in things religious, there is no middle ground among the uninstructed. They fly to the opposite pole. Therefore, when the new impulse seizes on the people, we are to have a breaking down of old barriers and a striving after a new order of things. But at the same time, a wild intolerance, a glorification of ignorance, a wholesale condemnation, a social upheaval, followed by a political triumph. One thing, however, is acquired definitely, a new lease of life for faith. It was good for the people to believe with all their heart after so much disbelief. It was good for them to make virtue paramount as the first all necessary step to a knowledge of God. It was good to set aside the things of the body and love the things of the soul. It was good to bring reality of life once more into the hearts of men. What it might have been if more temperate counsels had prevailed, who can say? The main fact was that one race was dying and another being born. The memories of the past crowded into the old brain, but the new brain was unable to register them except in their cruder forms. The memory, which succeeded in eventually impressing itself with most distinctness on the new brain, was perchance the most suited to the vigorous and warlike races that were to replace the old races of the Roman Empire. This memory was the tradition of the Jew. We are, of course, in this, only looking at the popular and outer side of the great movement which transformed the general religious consciousness of the ancient world. Within was much of great excellence, only a portion of which could be understood by the young brain of the new race. But now that the race is growing into manhood, it will remember more of it. It has already recovered its memory of science and philosophy, and its memory of a religion will doubtless ere long be brought through. We are still, however, looking at the outer conditions among which the Gnosis was working. At Alexandria, ever since its foundation, the Jews had been an important element in the life of the city. Through the translation of the Hebrew scriptures by the so-called 70, had been begun in the reign of Ptolemy Philadelphus, it does not seem to have attracted the attention of the Greek official savants. Jewish ideas at Alexandria were at that time confined to Jews, and naturally so, for in the beginning these most exclusive and intolerant religionists kept their ideas to themselves and guarded them jealously from the Gentiles. Later on, the Jewish schools at Alexandria were so esteemed by their nation throughout the East that the Alexandrian rabbis were known as the Light of Israel and continued to be the center of Jewish thought and learning for several centuries. Within these, it was that the Jews perfected their theories of religion and worked out what they had gleaned of Kabbalistic lore from the Chaldeans and Babylonians, and also from the wisdom traditions of Egypt. Many of the Hebrew doctors, moreover, were students of Grecian thought and literature and are therefore known as Hellenists. Some of these wrote in Greek, and it was chiefly through their works that the Grecian world derived its information on things Jewish. Aristobulus, whose date is unknown, but is conjecturally about BC 150, had endeavored to maintain that the peripatetic philosophy was derived from Moses, a wild theory that was subsequently developed and expanded to a ludicrous extent, and Plato, being substituted for Aristotle, was in the greatest favor even among the enlightened church fathers, as Clement of Alexandria and Origen. This theory of Aristobulus was the forerunner of the still more fantastic theory, invented by Justin Martyr, that the wisdom of antiquity, wherever found, was a plagiarism by anticipation of the devil in order to spite the new religion, and this pitiful hypothesis has been faithfully reproduced by Christian apologists almost down to our own time. Philo, however, is the most renowned of the Hellenists. He was a great admirer of Plato, and his works brings out many similarities between rabbinical religious thought and Greek philosophy. It is true that Philo's method of allegorical exegesis, whereby he reads highly philosophical conceptions into the crude narratives of the myths of Israel, is no longer regarded as legitimate, but his writings are nevertheless of great value. Philo believed not only that the Old Covenant documents were inspired in every part, but also that every name therein contained a hidden meaning of highest import. In this way, he strove to explain away the crudities of the literal narrative. But though Philo's method, whereby he could invoke the authority of Moses for the ideas of his school, is scientifically inadmissible, when the Bible documents are submitted to the searchings of historic and philological criticism, nevertheless his numerous tractates are of great importance as supplying us with a record of the ideas which were current in the circles or schools with which Philo was in contact. They are a precious indication and a valuable means of becoming acquainted with the scope of the Jewish gnosis in a propagandist form. Josephus, the famous historian, also wrote in Greek, and so made known his nation far and wide throughout the Greco-Roman world. Here, therefore, we have indications of the direct points of contact between Greek and propagandist Jewish thought. Now, Christianity in its popular origins had entirely entangled itself with the popular Jewish tradition of religion, a tradition that was innocent of all philosophy or Kabbalistic mysticism. The Gentiles, who were admitted into the new faith, however, soon grew restive at the imposition of the rite of circumcision, which the earliest propagandists insisted upon, and so the first heresy arose, and the Church of Jerusalem, which remained essentially Jewish in all things, speedily resolved itself into a narrow sect, even for those who regarded Judaism as the only forerunner of the new faith. As time went on, however, and either men of greater education joined their ranks, or, in their propaganda, they were forced to study themselves to meet the objections of educated opponents, wider and more liberal views obtained among a number of the Christians, and the other great religious traditions and philosophies contacted the popular stream. All such views, however, were looked upon with great suspicion by the Orthodox, or rather, that view which finally became Orthodox. And so, as time went on, even the very moderate liberalism of Clemens and Origen was regarded as a grave danger, and with the triumph of narrow orthodoxy and the condemnation of learning, Origen himself was at last anathemized. It was the Alexandrian school of Christian philosophy, of which the most famous doctors were the same Clemens and Origen, which laid the first foundations of general Christian theology, and that school owed its evolution to contact with Grecian thought. There is a pleasant story of its first beginnings to which we may briefly refer. Towards the end of the first century, the Christians established a school in Alexandria, the city of schools. It was a Sunday school for children called Didascalion. With courageous faith, it was established hard by the door of the world-famous museum, from whose chairs the general Christians, owing to their ignorance of art and science and philosophy, were excluded. From that same Sunday school, however, arose the vast fabric of Catholic theology, for the teachers of the Didascalion were forced to look to their laurels as soon as they numbered in their ranks men who had already received education in the Grecian school of thought and training. Such is a brief sketch of Alexandria and her schools, and it was in outer contact with such a seething world of thought and endeavor that some of the greatest of the Gnostic doctors lived, They were found, of course, elsewhere in the world, in Syria, Asia Minor, and Italy, in Gaul and Spain. But the best picture of the ancient world with which they were in outer contact is to be sketched in the city where Africa, Egypt and Africa, Rome and Greece, Syria and Arabia meet together. And that is going to bring us to the end of Alexandria. Hopefully I brought a little bit of enlightenment and not too much confusion to a somewhat difficult topic. I understand I have some unconventional beliefs and a tendency to step on toes when I relay those. It is not intentional, but it is not something I apologize for. Generally speaking, as long as we are just reading history or expositions of history, I'm not going to argue a whole lot, right? I'm not going to talk about, well, actually, these Christians lived 15 feet to the other side, right? That's not my purview. I'm here to discern truthful information from not truthful information and to disseminate as much as I can the wisdom that I discern. That is my goal as much as it was the goal of these people. Now, I can be misled just as much as they were, right? There was nothing to follow in the Jewish Bible. That is real, right? Once again, I refer you to the Bible study. There are some truths contained in there that will lead you to a better life, but there are definitely some things in there that are not going to lead you to a better life. You can take the concepts and, through education, you can get better ideas, right? These things were a good ground, referred to the science of logic, but now we have a different ground. We have a better understanding, and therefore the definition of what the baseline should be has changed. There was no chosen people. There was no prophet, right? There was no prophecy for a Messiah. These things are true. And so because of that, much of what is normally consumed is not correct. Now, I spend a great deal of my time in contemplation. I spend a great deal of my time in research, right? Y'all get to see some of that. This is what I do, right? I watch video documentaries of other people doing similar things to me, right? I am constantly seeking to refine my knowledge. And if I get something new, I will change my beliefs. You can watch that happen in the Bible study. If you like what I'm doing over here, let me know down below. Give me a like, a share, a follow. Throw me a comment. If you agree or disagree with anything that was stated, put it in the box down below. And if it remains respectful, it gets to remain up. If there is another work you would like to see me read or discuss, drop that in the box as well. And if you really like what I'm doing over here, hit me with that super thanks. Consider a membership or picking up a copy of my book. To the crew, thanks for hanging out. I appreciate every single minute that you are here with me, and I am praying for you every single day. Until next time, I love you. God loves you. You are perfect, whole, and complete just the way that you are. And this has been Pitt State. Peace.